Welcome to another episode of Corporate CPR, where we breathe life back into your organization, projects, and processes, giving you insights to recovery and avoiding corporate mortality events. Today, we will be talking about how to drive hypergrowth within organizations, and joining us to contribute to the conversation is Kurt Uhlir. Welcome, Kurt.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, can you share a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so I've fallen into roles where I tend to be called an operator over time. That's a term that means a lot in the private equity world. I'm a scaler, though. I come in, I help businesses of usually they have to be an established company. It's like I can't help a startup scale so much, but I help companies from $10 million, sometimes of $1 billion or more in annual sales. And we look at opportunities about how can we at least 10x, but maybe how do we put in place things so that we could 50x or 100x the business in a very short amount of time.
Oh, well, and so we're going to talk about hypergrowth. Can you kind of define that for us then before we get started?
Yeah, so I mean, I mentioned a little bit about those multiples there, but I think often it's important, not every company wants to become a billion-dollar company or this massive company. And there's a lot of problems with that. But there's a very different way of growing a business and thinking about what does success look like, or even surviving when you're putting in place things to grow 5%, 10% year over year, versus when you're looking at how do we 10x our revenue in this year or next year. And so hypergrowth really is that, hey, not that we wouldn't like to grow 5% or 10%, but how do we look at things from a scalability perspective to hopefully grow the revenue, but at the very least, come back and make things work a lot easier for the people that are here and our customers today.
Now, I assume that not every, like you were saying, not everybody can just go and scale their company. And there's probably some markets that aren't even really great for that. So how does a company even assess whether or not they're a candidate to have that type of scale?
I mean, I think the first thing is usually it does take somebody from the outside helping guide them kind of through that conversation, whether that's on the people and workforce side or somebody that's more on the business coaching side. But you can do it yourself by just saying, what would break in our company if we had 100 times the number of customers walk in the door in the next month? Like, what would break? And so that could be anything from, at one point, I've invested in both high technology companies and literally like e-commerce stores and retail shopping in Alabama. And so my brother and I started a series of 2 or 3 different store locations. And we were like, what would happen if we wanted to have 10 locations next year? So that changed. It took us a couple of years to get there with that business that he ran, but it allowed us to uncover problems in supply chain, problems in customer success, problems in billing. Our bank wasn't the right bank to be able to support locations in 7 different counties across the state as well. And so that process of kind of going through and saying, what would break if we had this massive inflow of revenue, which we'd all love to have, but that starts the kind of the conversation, because there's no reason to think about necessarily how do you go out and change a marketing or sales approach or a business development approach until could the company even support it if that was to happen?
Yeah, I mean, obviously scale is a real challenge. And sometimes, yeah, like you said, there's a lot of surprises and things that can go wrong. So what are the kind of the key elements, I guess, that you mentioned a few things like banking, but is there like a systematic way to kind of look at that, or how would you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, I would get to the revenue generation side towards the tail end, but up front, for me, it usually starts with customer, especially if you're a company that has an agency or a SaaS-based company that has reoccurring revenue from clients. I'm usually going to look first at account management or customer success. And so right now, I was part of a team that sold a decently large technology company to a large public company. And this woman runs all of that as a subsidiary now underneath us. And so she did this about 18 months ago, where she went through looking at their customer success team and just to say, hey, what would it take for them to be able to support like 5x the number of customers. And so what ended up happening was they weren't even looking to unlock hypergrowth. She went through to be, hey, if we wanted to do that, what automations would we have to take in place? What knowledge bases were they not having? Training wasn't set up right for new customers that were coming on board. And so she literally just went systematically through customer success from people don't know who they are or who we are, and they sign up on the website, to somebody who's been a customer for 10 years and they have pain points. And then she looked at what would that happen if all of the numbers for those clients had 2 zeros behind them. And that proceeded, it took them a little over a year to automate things with Zapier, build out knowledge base articles for the entire customer journey. But now they've been able to actually unlock a lot of growth in the company, just only focus on the customer success side. Because while they weren't looking to unlock hypergrowth, what they did was realize there was so much work that was manual work that they didn't realize before, that they were able to move to training, onboarding, and a lot of automations that didn't require people time. And now they were able to take much more one-on-one time, making customers successful.
Is it different for service companies versus product companies?
It can be, but it doesn't have to be. I mentioned, like, retail stores, a lot of times you have service companies operate the same way. And so, I mean, I've helped walk landscaping companies through this. And so you say, hey, you're doing, mid 6 figures, well, maybe a little bit into 7 figures from revenue. Well, what would that look like if you wanted to take that from a nice cash flow business to really much more of a lifestyle business where you could choose to show up to work and not have to? That you start looking at things where you, as the owner and often the operator at that point, you realize that, hey, what needs to take place in the business from a service perspective where you're not the person that's running everything? A lot of times I see service companies, whether they're marketing agencies or consulting agencies, they'll bring the founder that's found really good business, they'll bring in a CEO or president to actually run the business.
So, it's, if you have all the infrastructure in your organization to support the scale, I mean, how realistic is it to go and find, I guess, the revenue then to support that?
It depends. So I find a lot of times, so if I'm more on the SaaS-based side, as you start to put in place the processes to be able to support that massive growth, you have more time then to go after marketing opportunities. But at the very least too, I mean, my personal belief is the best way to get more customers is to make my current customers immaculately happy. And so when I go through with businesses and we find the top places to unlock hypergrowth, if it's there, you're able to free up so much time, like I mentioned Tiffany in this example, that they can go back to existing customers, not try to go do additional work for revenue, and just say, hey, we want to take some more time with you. I see you're being, you're happy, you're renewing, that's great. Here's where you're not as successful as other customers. Would you like basically free consulting? People usually appreciate that. When you come in and go, look, we're not going to charge you more. We just want to have more superhero stories. And in that case, you end up, the marketing kind of and sales come on the other side. Too many companies go out. I love pay-per-click. I'm a huge fan of SEO and content marketing. But the way those unlock the best is when you're not telling your company story, you're telling your customer's story, and they're the superheroes. And most of us just don't approach marketing that way. We go sell our value versus this is their story. We're just part of it.
That's fascinating. You mentioned just a second ago, though, you said the hypergrowth if it's there. So when is it not there? How do you know when it's not there?
Well, I mean, it's always going to be easier if you have a technology-based solution. I mean, you're selling services. A lot of times, if you're selling products, widgets, I've worked a lot with companies that qualify for the Made in America label. A lot of times, it's from a manufacturing perspective. You can grow very large at that point. Then, if you're doing something like the landscaping company I mentioned, you're often not going to. I mean, that's not an industry that you're going to get to hypergrowth in. Doesn't mean it's not it's I find it's great to protect your business and to get the lifestyle that you like, both for you and your employees, by still following that path that we talked through. Because, wow, wouldn't you much rather be able to support your existing client base or double or triple that landscaping business with a fraction of the effort? Well, that's what it looks like on the other side. I've seen people do that for marketing agencies or actually landscaping companies where they're able to double or triple the business. That's not hyper growth, but they're able to have a much larger business. They're able to help grow the people that were working for them when they were at an earlier stage. And then the person gets to decide, do I want to keep doing this, or do we want to do something else? We have a family member that's kind of done this repeatedly in South Georgia. And so at this point, she is that businesswoman at this point, almost runs a large portion of the small town. She starts up a business here. She ends up finding somebody else to help run that part of the business, the day-to-day operations, and goes and starts something else, and maybe does that with a franchise business. That's something you can choose to do if you want to, or you can just go spend time with your family as well.
Yeah. So have you come across companies who've experienced this type of growth and weren't prepared for it? And then what are the pitfalls of that?
Yeah, the problems are, if you're not prepared for it, you have to have a really strong ability to say no. And so the problems are, like, especially like on technology SaaS-based companies, people often, like, they don't realize how quickly growth can happen. They don't have a bench of people behind them to support that growth. They haven't started relationships. They haven't started an advisory board that could go out and tap into other people. And then when their product actually connects, which everybody's hoping for, the proper thing to do is, if they can't support it from an operations perspective, is to stop bringing on customers. But it's really hard for most people to do that. And so then that gets into a very difficult place where, if they've raised money, the investors are going to push for different decisions in leadership, which isn't great if you're that founder. But it ends up being stressful as well in ways that people don't want.
And do you find like issues with attrition then with people? I mean, does that result in turnover, and not saying no to customers, but maybe continuing to say yes to customers during a time of hyper growth when the company doesn't have a bench, the infrastructure for it?
Yes, it does lead to attrition in employees for sure, because you're going to end up burning out employees. I'm a huge believer in growing your current employees and doing so ahead of time as well, so that they'll be there to support you as that growth happens. At the very least, they'll be more qualified in the roles that they're currently in. But if you don't say no, the problem is most people end up stepping into positions where, like, they end up becoming much more authoritative and from a leadership style, and so they demand more of their employees without realizing, it's really unconsciously, that, like, if you're my employee and I own the business, why should I ever expect you to work as much as me? I shouldn't. And so you can get through a lot of that from adjusting compensation, doing profit sharing plans, but that's still only going to get you so far if you haven't started building the bench, and especially investing in people, which does take both time it costs dollars, but also takes time when you decide to send people to leadership training, customer success training, sales training. It means they're not showing up to the day-to-day job, and you should be paying them to go and grow like that.
We've experienced, and even in our organization, there's a little bit of the chicken and egg, I guess, scenario. Like, how much do you invest in resources before you need them versus waiting until you need them, and therefore, because at that point, then you actually have the revenue to support it?
Yeah, I think it depends. And so I do think it's helpful to separate different parts of the business. You might treat customer success different than you would, the factory
Finance.
floor. Yeah. But I think it's also helpful to think about the current team and kind of treat everybody together. And so I very much like, we're staying on the customer success example. There's only, like, kind of one company that's starting to get into certification and, like, normal training for customer success teams. Well, you could choose to just send the head of customer success through. You'll get much better results from the whole team and be prepared later on if you send everybody through at once. They get to learn together. They can gel back and forth. They now have a common terminology. And I think that's the proper way to kind of look at investing ahead of time, is what is something that makes sense to put the whole team through? And then you may cherry pick individual leaders where you see opportunity, and either choose to start doing one-on-one coaching, or look for ways to bring in mentors for those as well. So I tend to do that for people that work directly for me. I will either mentor them myself, or I have peers that I trust that aren't going to poach my employees, but that I will that are really good at different roles. And so at no cost, I'll step in and fill a role for them, coaching somebody on their team, and then customer success, I can hand off somebody on my team to them as well.
Oh, that's some good insights. I guess I was thinking actually even more so in the actual, you were talking about companies sometimes start to experience this growth because they don't, they don't realize how fast it can happen. And so they don't even have the people. So I guess that's where I'm saying, how do you know, like, maybe you're like, I do want to experience this, 10 times growth. Do you go and start hiring some of those people ahead of time and risk being unprofitable, or do you wait until the business is there, or how do you kind of assess that piece?
It depends on the business. If you're in a technology side, there is this multiple that investors, whether it's your money or especially outside investors, they're looking for like overall top growth and profit growth and bottom. And so you can lose a lot of money as long as you're growing enough at the top side. And so there is a place there to invest well ahead of revenues for there. But for individual, for private companies where it's your money, you and family members, you and a couple of partners, I really take the approach of profit first. And so the company should not jeopardize really, for me, it's not just providing for your family as the owner, it's the families of everybody that's working for you. And so if you have 24 people working for you, you're risking 24 households if you decide to go negative from a cash flow perspective. And so unless you have the bandwidth and the margin to bankroll for the next couple of years, I'll never advise somebody to go ahead and invest well ahead of that growth.
Yeah, well, I guess that would be a mortality event, wouldn't it? If you had
It would be, but
your dozen
a lot of
employees.
companies do that. They hope for the best. I mean, it's the same reason Dave Ramsey exists and teaches people about credit card debt. It's because business owners so often they don't realize about taking money and taking profit when they should, and taking profit over the years. And so too often businesses will get up, and I mean, I'll step in at times and it's a $17 million business and they're making like 1% take home for the founders. And I'm like, well, we need to change some things real quick. This woman that in the real estate space, but also one of her businesses had a marketing agency helping other agents set up their marketing plans and their technology systems. And when she came down to spend a day with me, and she's walking through her business, and it was exactly that. Like, if she had gotten sick herself or something, she was the operator. There wasn't enough money from a profit perspective to bring in somebody else. And I'm looking at the value she's giving clients, and the other side, the businesses, she didn't realize it, but was on life support. Any of us could have a car accident or anything else. She'd have had, I think it was 6 or 7 employees at the time would have all basically been out of work if she couldn't show up and help run things. So in that one meeting where we were together, we saw the value. She added a substantial amount to her pricing and was able to very quickly hire a head of operations. And now that business I think they've more than doubled in size just from that one move. And customers are still very happy. And I think she should increase prices again.
No, I mean, I read a book. I can't remember if it was like the 6-figure woman or something like that. But it was talking about how you just keep raising your prices and until people don't buy your product anymore. Like, keep kind of testing that. Right. And seeing how far you can go, because oftentimes we undervalue what we do, was essentially the message of the book. But whether you agree with that whole philosophy or not, there is some truth in that like a lot of times, especially small companies, right? People undervalue themselves quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of having non-competitive peers, sometimes competitive peers, but in different local markets, especially if I'm in a local market, in basically mastermind kind of experiences. So I have a friend that's recently, maybe 3 years ago, came out of product management for large public companies, and he started a general contracting business. And so we're very intimate in sharing different parts of our business back and forth. And he sees things in my day-to-day team's operations that I would never see because of his background and where he's at right now. And the same thing when I am able to look in and take time to see into his contracting business.
What do you, so you mentioned that you help even you help companies even get to $1 billion. So when you're talking about those, small organizations, mid-size, and, maybe even a little larger than that, are there differences in what that hypergrowth how that plays out, or who's better primed for something like that?
Yes and no. I mean, it does. It's actually harder for larger organizations, depending on their culture, and so it does really matter who's, how they've been growing. I find mid-sized and larger companies that have really followed a servant leadership approach. Their team has a culture of adapting much more, and they give each other much more grace, and they're willing to try new things and push a little bit more when need be. The company who's gotten to $100 million, $200 million, and they've been very authoritative and very micromanaging a lot of times, those teams, it's going to be very hard for them to unlock hypergrowth because their teams aren't used to it. They don't have permission to try things, and so at that point, they need to look at like almost a complete change of culture, which is really hard to accomplish without a massive change of leadership. Small companies, though, you don't have that much of a difficult. I mean, you can take a 13 or 30 person company, bring in 1 or 2 additional leaders, or bring in 3 or 4, even frontline people that have much more of a servant leadership approach, or have much more, have a different approach of how they look at problems. People who thrive in healthy conflict, and you've just changed the entire organization at that point.
Absolutely. You kind of touched on what my next question was going to be, was really around, if you are doing that hyper growth with those large, when you're going 10x and you already have 100 employees, I mean, that's pretty substantial growth you would have. How do you get everybody flying in the same formation? I would think that everybody being in lockstep would be super critical to experience hypergrowth.
Yeah, a great question. You really have to take a process of kind of going slow to be able to go fast, where leadership has to point out the vision and the outcomes the company's trying to achieve, and go systematically down to the individual for helping people to identify why are you working? Why are you choosing to be here? Yes, we all need to pay bills, but why are you choosing? What does that mean for you? Do you have a family at home? Do you have young kids? Do you have elderly parents? Or do you have a faith background? Helping the individuals to actually identify what is meaningful to them and how that connects with the business. You have to take that approach if you want people to be able to show up and really do more than just phone in their 40 hours or 50 hours on a weekly basis.
How, one of the things that's, I guess this is probably more, it might be true for those mid-sized companies, but it's probably more true for maybe those smaller companies who are trying to get to a hyper growth, is what's the balance between structure and agility? Meaning, a lot of entrepreneurs obviously are very agile and probably don't have a lot of structure, but I would think that infrastructure and having structured processes is really important, so that then when you have that growth, it's something to fall back on. So how do you balance that kind of being responsive and being able to change, as well as having good systems and processes and all of that, to make sure that if all of a sudden you land another 100 deals, you actually have, like you were talking about, automation or something to support it?
Great question. Some of it comes from hiring. And so I mentioned this woman, Tiffany. We have another woman that works for her. I would almost say that her best skill in anything work-wise is she's a documenter. And so I could talk through a process, I could talk through what I do. And I mean, SOPs will just, standard operating procedures will just flow out of her. And she enjoys doing that. She enjoys asking questions of other people. I like seeing those. I love going through and editing them. If you give me a blank slate to document them, that's not my skill set. And so I need to pair with somebody like her in the organization that's actually part of their skill set. And now there's other things, like my wife and I joke, we run our properties and our household on Trello. Like, we have a column for errands and buying, because when you go to Costco, you buy different things than when you go to the grocery store. So I have a checklist that I can pop up at any time and see what's there. And so I do have that agile approach, but documenting the procedures for how do we respond to customers, and writing out the macro that I can pound out in Slack for a difficult situation. Here's how I would respond to a client. you need somebody else then to go and put that into Zendesk as a macro that others can hit, automatically reply on.
Yeah, we're lucky that some of our in our business, we actually have on staff business consultants to help our clients, and luckily they help us as well.
Yeah.
Write our SOPs. It's amazing how helpful that is. And then I lost my question. So now when you think about your leadership team, then how important is it? Because obviously. Founder, especially if it's like a founder or something, how would you say this? They have their strengths and weaknesses. So how important is it to have a really diversified, I guess, leadership group in order to achieve this? And what do you look for in that type of leadership group?
I'm less concerned about it being diversified from skill sets and more being diversified from approaches to things. So that sometimes comes from backgrounds. I very much look for leadership that matches certain things like you're going to see in their actions, bias towards action. Especially on leadership, I don't want anybody that's going to sit on their feet, sit on their hands and go and wait for me to have to come try to solve the problem. I want them to bring a problem. Maybe I've already started to implement and go, hey, I need somebody else to look at this. I want people that they understand healthy conflict. Like I literally, that's in every job description I hire for at any company, because conflict scares a lot of people nowadays. And there's no way to be in leadership, but especially look at how do you document things or adapt things or try to make things better, unless you're willing to at least understand that, hey, conflict, there's no way to avoid it. It's with people. And I'd much rather you bring up a potential issue that may not actually be an issue. I'd rather you bring it up early than 6 months down the line when it's affecting 36 customers. And so that concept of looking for people in leadership that are willing to have that kind of approach and understand like they're here for different reasons. They may be here for different things, but we all have some of those traits that you will see.
Yeah, and I guess when I was thinking kind of similar, you got people who maybe are conceptual or you're highly analytical and trying to balance out maybe some of those ways of thinking. You mentioned that you have a mastermind and things like that. So, do people need to be making sure that they've got that? Looking at problems from all angles and making sure there's somebody, on their team that can help them with that.
I think you have to make sure that everybody is willing to accept accountability and often hold others accountable as well. I don't think the leadership team always has to be doers. I don't think you all have to be creatives either. It's actually wonderful sometimes for me. I mean, I'm a doer. I like doing things. I actually, while I love spending people time, I love getting into the ditch and kind of digging ditches at times as well, spending time with clients. But where I also thrive a lot of times is I'll come in and support the CEO, and where he or she is the visionary and they have wonderful ideas and they want to talk to people, but implementation is not their skill set. The EOS, the Entrepreneur Operating System, is one approach that's good for some companies to follow. I don't necessarily follow that myself, but I tend to come in to support the queen or the king, and I kind of joke I'm the kingmaker. That's my skill set. I enjoy doing that because I also love working for the visionary billionaire or want to be billionaire and saying, what are your dreams and hopes? Often I have to understand what really what their personal goal is, but I'm like, I can help make that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. What are your thoughts around, is there any low hanging fruit in all of, I guess, when you're looking at scaling, massive scale, are there areas where people are leaving revenue on the table, I guess, that they can look at to maybe even be a catalyst for growth?
Potentially. I think often the easiest way to find where you could be charging more, or having new services to add in, is going to a couple of your current customers and telling them what you're trying to do and being very clear about, I'm not going to charge you more. I love the terms of early access as well. I'm like, look, I'll go to customers or walk in the door with clients and say, hey, look, let's go find 5 customers and tell them what we're trying to do. We're trying to 10x your revenue. We want to charge more, find other products. And so here's what we're going to tell them. Tell me everything that every piece of value that I could be charging you for. I'm not going to change your pricing, because in the kind of the openness for that, people often don't believe you. And it is like, look, if I understand what's going on with you and how I could either help you more in your business, change our service offering to make things valuable to you, I can make way more money with the other 99% of my clients or all these new clients, but I'll never unlock that without here. So if anything, I may come back to you and just be wonderfully grateful for the growth in my company. And so I've seen some companies where they actually do the exact opposite. Instead of just going in and promising companies, they go, look, I'll share with you how my business is growing. And if it grows the way that I think it's going to, from you being transparent and giving me raw feedback, like I've seen people, even service companies come back and go, look, we're not going to charge you now for the next 12 months. You've unlocked so much value for us and new customers. And then a couple interesting things happen. One is no customers ever believe you when you say that you're not going to charge them for something you've been charging them for the last 3 years. But you will get so many more referrals from those customers because they'll never tell anybody, I'm not paying for this. What they'll say is, oh my gosh, this is what's happening in my business.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. And so, I guess what would your is there any sort of shift in, I guess, mentality then of all of this? Like if you're preparing for this growth, do the leaders need to shift their mentality? Do the team need to shift their mentality? How do you really get ready, I suppose, and for the ride?
Yeah, great question. I think it's a combination of things that almost seem opposite. The first is looking at, to a large degree, what could we possibly automate and take out manual time with, whether that's manual time training customers or things that something like Zapier or ChatGPT might be able to help automate. On the other side, it's looking for opportunities within your customers to do for one what you wish you could do for many. So look at time with your customers where, as you're starting to free up some time over here, how can you then start to spend much more time that's even than justifiable to try to know what's actually going on with your customers, because that's how you're going to unlock new ways to be able to sell to them, sell to others, grow the business, when you actually step in and understand what their real pain points are that much more.
Well, Kurt, this has been really fascinating. Do you have like 3 things you want to leave top of mind for our audience today?
Yeah, the first thing is I tend to talk a lot about high achieving servant leadership. I have seen repeatedly it is very difficult to unlock hypergrowth in an authoritative, micromanaging kind of approach where if you don't do what I say, kind of behind there's always the threat of, or you will be fired. And so we all have to deliver, but I think if people start to adopt a real servant leadership approach, that's one of the mentalities that unlocks business growth and opportunities. Another one is a concept of net weaving over networking. Networking always feels a little self-serving to me, versus net weaving is more of looking for what's going on in your business. And like we've all taken somebody's business card or given them our business card, and we can see them make that judgment that says, they're not going to be able to help me in the business, and they almost walk away. Change that approach even when you're meeting somebody at church or the Civitans Club, and be like, hey, look, is there like, when you take an approach and you look at that, you might be able to make a 5-minute phone call introduction that changes that person's life or career. Look for those opportunities. Then you have to practice doing that, and then you'll start doing it in your business. And the third thing I already mentioned is do for one what you wish you could do for many. And then that's going to unlock opportunities that then you can go look to multiply.
Excellent. Well, Kurt, how can folks find out more about what you do or get in touch with you?
My personal website at kurtuhlir.com. I'm spending a lot of time writing right now. I've actually turned down 2 book deals because both were from publishers that they wanted to control the content a little bit more. And I'd much rather, one, give it away, but being able to do talks with people like you and share that without having to go to somebody that technically owns the IP at that point.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and to our audience, until next time, keep your organizations healthy.